Okay, everybody, welcome back. This is the second video lecture on Chapter 1 of Human Growth and Development. In the previous lecture, I was talking about what human growth and development is, the definitions and its goals, and we ended talking about the three domains. And you remember those domains are the physical, the cognitive, and the socio-emotional. In this lecture, I want to talk about I want to talk about developmental stages, what we mean by developmental stages, and then get into some of the influences, which really is what this whole chapter is about, what the influences on development are. When we talk about developmental stages, what's important to understand is that these are what social scientists call social constructs. In other words, so briefly, what a developmental stage is would refer to like toddlerhood, childhood, adolescent, adulthood, right? But the when we go from being an infant to a toddler, from a toddler to a preschooler, that's all quite arbitrary, right? And what I mean by arbitrary is society has come up with some rules that say if you have been out of your mother's womb for less than 12 months, you're considered an infant. But at 12 months and 2 days, now we call you a toddler, right? And you become an adult. Well, that's my favorite question is when are you an adult? I ask these questions also in my sociology class, because in the sociology class, we talk a lot about the idea of a social construct. And what we mean by social constructs is these are ideas that are constructed by society, right? And so what it means to be an adult is an idea. And every culture has different rules about what it means to be an adult, and when you become an adult, what privileges, what responsibilities you have, to be an adult. One of my favorite sort of illustrations of this idea that life stages are a social construct is the phrase "act your age." Right? And parents say this often, lots of people say this, and usually they're implying that you're not acting your age, right? Well, what is the specific age? How is a 9-year-old supposed to act? And depending on or act like an adult. Well, what kind of adult? Like a young adult, a middle-aged adult? I mean, think about it. I mean, the reality is that there are rules that our society and expectations that we have for people in a certain group in a certain age, but the significance is those rules vary from one culture to another culture. A couple important ones to point out in our culture is the idea of childhood and adolescence. Both of these are modern. And children, at one point in even American history, you were capable of work or you weren't. There was no sort of sacred period. So you were dependent on being carried around, which meant you weren't capable of work. But once your body was large enough to work in the coal mines, you went to work. There was nothing special or sacred about being a child, right? There was no understanding, and this is where the developmental psychologists, are interested in. There was no understanding that a child's brain thinks differently. The same thing with adolescence. Adolescence is one of my favorite chapters actually to talk about, because our culture and your textbook, the definition of adolescence is from the time that our body, right, that domain, hits puberty. So that's when your body changes, and boys have their sperm seed, and women have their mincy, right? Until some arbitrary stage of 2025, that's all considered adolescence. And what is expected of adolescence really depends on the family that you grow up in. That's a fun one to talk about too. Another one is how exactly is an old person supposed to act? Right? I mean, on one hand, so you see this lady over here, what is the cultural rules and when is old? I mean, the classic one is that you see on social media, I used to think 40 was old till I got to 40, or, the idea that what we mean by old is changes as we get older. Even, once upon a time, a 30-year-old was old until you got to 30, and then you realize 30-year-olds are just youngins. Okay. So that's the point about that, is that these are all arbitrary. We, for our purposes, we will have definitions of these different stages, but do understand that that if you were to go to a different culture, there may not even be an adolescence. I know in some native and indigenous cultures, you go from being a child to an adult, and there are some groups that have like rites of passage, like oh fooey, I never say the word right, but in Hispanic culture, when the 16th birthday or the 15th birthday, or in some sort of Gilded Age cultures, you'd have had a coming out ball. I don't think that's when you were presented. That meant you were eligible to be dated. In Jewish tradition, you'd had a bat mitzvah, or bar mitzvah. Those were rites of passages that you moved. But for just, for non-Jewish white folk, there's no sort of when you go from being a child to an adult. And some argue that's why adolescence is hard, but we'll talk more about that when we get to the chapter on adolescence. Okay, so a couple slides here about these influences. What influences, and again, this is the wheelhouse of developmental psychologists. This slide refers to the role of nature and nurture, or heredity, the things that we are born with and have no control over, and the things that we experience. A lot of the things we experience, we also have no control over. They just happen to be a part of the environment. Maturation is the fancy term for how we change over the course of our life. But the question is, for developmental psychologists and so other social scientists, is what's the relationship between my heredity, what I'm born with, my genes, right, and how the environment affects me. So this is sort of also the wheelhouse of sociologists or socialization sociologists, social psychologists, right? This is a question that a lot of social scientists focus on, but this is like the whole of what developmental psychologists are exploring. Other influencers, right, or is the context. And what we mean by the context is the situation. In the next chapter, we'll talk about theory, and there's one theorist who has his whole theory is based on the context in which one lives and is born into. But when we talk about contexts, we're talking about the family group that you're born into, right? Is it a bio mother and a bio father? Is it just one parent? Is it parents of the same sex? Are you born into, or are you raised in a multi-generational family? Because all of these things will be part of the environment that influence you. One thing I did read in your textbook was how in the United States, there is an increase in the number of multi-generational households. We used to sort of be known for not having multi-generational households, but there's actually been an increase, and that would mean children. It would mean like my kids living with my mother and me. It'd be me, my mother, and my children, which we actually lived with them twice, or they lived with us. Your social economic status, which is a fancy term for basically where you sit in terms of wealth, education, the economy. Do you live in a rural, isolated trailer park, or do you live in a gated community? And where the occupations your parents have, the people that you're surrounded with, right? So this has to do also with context. If you're going to school with senators' kids, it's a really different experience. You're going to learn different things than if all of your classmates' parents happen to be incarcerated, right? So that's your context. And this predicts, when we talk about protective factors or risk factors, the economic environment, the social status that I inhibit, can either make things easier for me, give me opportunities, or can provide challenges that I have to use my psychic and emotional resources to overcome. Your culture, so I put this one together, right, because we're not in a sociology class, but your culture, your ethnic, and your racial identity. All of these things come with, and race and ethnicity are not the same thing. We'll talk about that. Race refers to someone's biological, there's one human race, right? Your ethnicity is your culture, your heritage, your religion, your language, right? And it's your ethnicity that informs things like, well, actually, your race does too, because our culture teaches race, treats race as if it was somehow a distinction instead of a social construct. But the point is that what group I identify with comes with different expectations. I'm treated differently by the larger society. The way my parents parent, do they whoop on you? Do they not whoop on you? Do my parents go to a working class job where they clock in and clock out? Do they go to a job where they use their minds, right? I mean, because all of these things will influence how a parent, are they military? They'll all influence how I experience the world as I grow up. And a teenager whose parents are military or police officers will probably have a different experience again than a teenager who lives in urban Los Angeles, right? So all of those, your context. And then what's really interesting to me is the idea of the historical context in which you come of age in. And what we mean by this is, so great examples really just happened, right? A child born during COVID, when everybody's faces were covered, may have gone up to 2 years without actually seeing a person's full face in real life, right? Or so your social expectations is everything in lockdown? Are jobs available? Are jobs not available? When I came of age, for instance, I came of age when like the Russians were the bad people. Other people would have come of age when Muslim people. So all of the World War II, the Great Depression, what is expected, or the opportunities, very similar to these others, right? But the opportunities, the expectations, the fears um, of of the larger society also influence what we're offered, and what we are. Yeah. I'll just, well, we're okay. I'm gonna stop right there. All of those influence. When the next chapter or the next video lecture, I'm going to talk about a concept called normative and non-normative.